אחר צהריים טובים לכולם. אנחנו לקראת מושב הסיום של הכנס שלנו, כנס הדוקטורנטים הראשון על שם ציפי קויפמן, זיכרונה לברכה. ואני, לפני שאני מזמין את יהודה, פרופסור יהודה אלפר, להציג את פרופסור ליסקה, אז אני רוצה לומר כמה מילים גם של תודה וגם של הודעה לעתיד. אני לא יודע למה, אבל דוקטור רחל לוי דרומר הגיע במיוחד לפה בכדי לוודא שאני מודיע לכם על התוכנית החדשה שקיבלה אישור שבוע שעבר, של פתיחה של מגמת כתיבה של פילוסופיה יהודית, כתיבה הגותית יהודית. מי שקצת עוקב אחרי הפייסבוק ראה כבר את הכותרת המוזרה שמסתובבת שקוראים לה מלאכת מחשבת, שמשחקת קצת על הרעיון הזה שפילוסופיה יהודית צריך גם ליצור ולכתוב ולא רק לחשוב על. אז זו מגמה שאנחנו מפרסם אותה באופן רשמי יותר מאוחר, אבל אז הנה, כנראה בגלל זה באת ואני מודה לך מאוד על הנוכחות שלכם. זה תמיד מצחיק שהביטוי של המזכירה האקדמית לא מבטא מה זה אומר. אז זה תפקיד מאוד מאוד מרכזי באוניברסיטת בר אילן. אני רוצה מאוד מאוד להודות לעינת צוקרמן, שמלווה אותנו פה בכל כך הרבה דברים, שנמצאת איתנו, מקבלת את פנינו, מברכת אותנו, ועוסקת הרבה מאוד בכדי שכל האירועים, כל המערכת, כל התוכניות, כל הכנס הזה יצליח להתקיים. אז עינת, תודה רבה לך. וכשהיא לא יודעת מה לעשות, אז היא מעמיסה לי את היומן בעוד פגישות רק. לא סתם בחיוך. תודה רבה. אני מאוד רוצה להודות לדוקטור ליאור זקס שמואלי, ולדוקטור צחי הרשקוביץ על היוזמה של כל הפורום של הדוקטורנטים, על כל ההובלה שלו, על כל מה שקרה סביב באמת ביצירה הזאת של שיח חדש בין דוקטורנטים שהוא כל כך משמעותי להתקדמות של מחקר, וללא ספק על הכנס עצמו עם כל מה שהיה בו, עם כל העידוד שנדרש לו, שלפחות המחמאות שאני מקבל על הכנס הזה במהלך היומיים האלה הם כאלה ששווה, ואני את כל המחמאות מעביר ישר לשורה 6 פה בצד, מגיע להם המון תודה. תודה רבה ליאור, תודה רבה צחי, באמת. בשביל שאני לא אתבלבל במונח בעברית, שעשו לילות כימים בכדי שזה יקרה. אז באמת המון תודה על מה שקרה פה, והרבה מאוד תודה למרצים, למרצות שהשתתפו פה, שזה רגע מאוד מרגש בשביל כולנו. תודה רבה ליהודה, שבצניעותו, בשקט שבו פועל, שזה יקרה. ציפי כבר לא פה, אבל אני עדיין מודה לה. תודה רבה לציפי על כל העזרה שלה בכל האירוע הזה. אתה רוצה לומר משהו, שרית?
אני רוצה להגיד בשם הדוקטורנטים, תודה על הזכות העצומה על היום הזה, שהוא בעצם ביטוי של תקופה ארוכה, כבר כמעט יותר משנה, שמתנקזת לתקופה, לפחות מבחינתי ארוכה עוד יותר, אבל אני חושבת שהמחלקה הזו, ואנחנו יודעים גם מה קורה במקומות אחרים, יש בה תחושה חזקה של בית, של תמיכה, של חברות, של אכפתיות ושל רצינות. וכל הדברים האלה לחוקרים צעירים זה לא דבר ברור מאליו, וצעירים לאו דווקא בגיל, אלא בשלב המקצועי שלהם. ואני חושבת שחלק מהפנים שיושבות כאן, אין אנשי הצוות, אבל גם הקולגות שלנו, הדוקטורנטים, נהיו פה חברויות מדהימות. והדבר הזה בהקשר שלנו, באמת אני רוצה להגיד בשם הדוקטורנטים שאנחנו מדברים בינינו, תודה עצומה לדוקטור ליאור זקס שמואלי ולדוקטור צחי הרשקוביץ, שבאמת שיתפו אותנו בסודות מקצועיים, וברוח טובה, ובתחושה של מסוגלות, וזה לא ברור מאליו, כי לפעמים כלפי חוץ נראה שמי שעושה את הדברים זה פשוט לא, אבל זה לא פשוט, וזה שיש אנשים בדרך, גם חברים וגם אנשי צוות שנמצאים שם, זה מאוד מאוד חשוב בכל מיני צמתים, ולך חנוך, זה פשוט מעורר השראה מה נהיה מהמקום הזה, ואני מרגישה באמת זכות גדולה, כי כשעשיתי את התואר השני אצל חנוך, היית מרצה במכללה דרך בכלל התוכנית של המורים, וככה קטונתי, אבל אני מסתכלת מהצד, גם כל אחד מאיתנו יש לו גם תפקידים אחרים בחוץ, ולראות מה נהיה מהמקום הזה, אני מרגישה זכות עצומה, אני צריך לכתוב עוד דוקטורט נראה לי, כדי להתחיל מחדש, אל תדאג, זה לא יקרה. אבל באמת, גם הפן האישי וגם הפן המקצועי, שמתערבבים בצורה כל כך קסומה, ומשאירים את החוויה עם מה שהתחלתי איתו, שזה בית, וזה מקום שנעים להיות בו, זו אומנות פשוט מדהימה שאפשר ללמוד ממנה, ופשוט הרגשתי צורך, באמת בשם כולנו, בלי הרבה הכנה, להגיד תודה רבה, כי הרגשתי שאי אפשר לסגור את היום הזה בלי התודות שלנו. באמת בשם כולנו, תודה לכם, לכולכם.
כן, גם תודה לכולם, לכל המארגני הכנס, התומכים בכנס, הפועלים בכנס, לעינת שטרחה יומם ולילה, גם לציפי קסטנוביץ'. אני יכול גם לומר בתור מישהו בוגר המחלקה, אני גם עשיתי דוקטורט פה, שזה היה מאוד מאוד עוזר לי, אילו היה דבר כזה, כמו היום הזה לפני כמה שנים. ובאמת מרשים מאוד לשמוע כל מה שקורה פה, כל המגוון הענק והרחב של הנושאים. ואני חושב שעם זאת, אין דרך יותר נעים לסיים את היום הזה מאשר הרצאה מפרופסור ויויאן ליסקה, שבאה אלינו היום מאוניברסיטת אמסטרדם, ששם היא מכהנת כמנהלת המכון ליהדות. שם יש לה, היא כתבה המון על כל הנושאים החשובים בפילוסופיה יהודית מודרנית, כוללים הנושאים של היום, אגמבם ובכלל, וזו זכות מאוד, אני לא צריך להרחיב כי אני בטוח שכולם מכירים אותה, אז זו זכות מאוד גדולה לקבל את פניה, והיא תרצה היום באנגלית בנושא How Jewish were the writings and identity of Franz Kafka and Walter Benjamin, a reflection on a title. אז בבקשה.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this lecture. I feel terrible that my Hebrew is still not good enough to give a lecture in this language. I live here on and off for a while, and I hope that eventually I will be able to. But at this point, it still has to be in English, and I hope that it will be clear and even more so entertaining enough to keep you with me. I regret that I couldn't be here for the lectures before. I just arrived back from New York last night, and yeah, it took me some time to settle back in and get here. I would also like to thank you for inviting me with this open topic, asking me, well, anything that could be interesting for Israeli doctoral students. And I thought of this lecture and this title because it is both very specific, but also general enough to possibly have some bearings on other topics that people are working on. I will start with the title. Maybe you realize that the subtitle is somewhat strange. Muzar, that word I learned, I don't know why, but I learned it before I could buy groceries here. So, you might think that this title is merely a puzzling captatio benevolentia to be intriguing. But it requires some elucidation and some explanation. The title itself is indeed a quote. It is a quote by a colleague of mine who invited me to give this lecture. It was a lecture at the Leo Baeck Institute a few years ago, and Professor Steve Aschheim said, "Oh, Vivian, you're going to talk about how Jewish were the writings and identity of Franz Kafka and Walter Benjamin." Strangely enough, I felt uneasy without knowing why. The title made me uneasy, and I wanted to figure it out. And that's why the subtitle. And this is indeed what I'm going to do. I agreed that I would do it because I realized that it would be an opportunity to think about some core issues. I've been working on German Jewish literature for many years, on Jewish issues. Doing something like that, indeed, it didn't come out of the blue. And yet, when I was asked to do this head-on, it was strange. So this will be part of the story, because it is framed by this invitation and what followed. I tried to turn the uneasiness of the title into something fruitful. So the title is a question, and I will address this question directly to show the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of giving an answer not only in 45 minutes, but altogether. Although this doesn't mean that there is nothing to say about the topic. I will use the title itself as a heuristic means to reflect on the complexity, but also on what is at stake in the title, and in the best case, in the course of this reflection, will provide you with some insights into Kafka's and Walter Benjamin's Jewishness. Franz Kafka and Walter Benjamin are among the major figures of German Jewish modernism. They were born in 1880. In the 1880s, Kafka dies in 1924, Walter Benjamin in 1940. Their parents were largely assimilated Jews, so-called four-day Jews, meaning that they went to the synagogue 4 times a year, the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and when the Kaiser came. Kafka and Benjamin are part of world literature and world thought. They had only limited knowledge of Judaism. They are most of the time discussed in contexts outside of Judaism. They were not religious. They were very ambivalent Zionists, if one could even call them that. Benjamin was a victim of anti-Semitism and exile, but we will not define Jewishness à la Sartre by how anti-Semites saw them. So what do they have with Jews and Judaism? And mainly, what does it mean to ask this question? The quickest reply would be to answer with what Kafka and Benjamin, but also Arendt and Paul Celan, each in their own way, have called the Selbstverständlichkeit, the self-evidence of their Jewishness. And I have here a nice little collection. Arendt, in her famous epistolary exchange with Gershon Scholem, writes, I've always regarded my Jewishness as one of the indisputable factual data of my life. Walter Benjamin writes, the Jewish is always, das Jüdische, in English sounds a bit funny to say this, the Jewish is always self-understood. Everything Jewish that goes beyond the self-evident seems dangerous to me. Now that sentence in itself would require a whole explanation. Franz Kafka, und dann das Judentum, then Judaism. You're asking me, he writes this to his friend Milena Jesenska. You're asking me if I'm Jewish? Maybe it's a joke that you're even asking. Vielleicht ist das nur ein Scherz. And finally, Paul Celan. The self-evidence of my Jewishness in the midst of all this, you, Ilana, that was his last friend, female friend on his visit in Jerusalem, back from Chernowitz. The self-evidence of my Jewishness in the midst of all this, you, Ilana, understand it, even if I no longer can formulate it. There are a few more by Freud and some other lesser figures, but it is quite striking, especially given that the Jewishness of all these figures was everything but self-evident. So what is it that made these figures, who are otherwise so rich with words, how did they become so wordless when talking about this? As I said, the self-evidence certainly does not correspond to the complexity of Kafka's and Benjamin's relationship to things Jewish. The question has a long history from the earliest reception of Kafka and Benjamin, and entire libraries by now exist about the topic, and it's being enriched by the day, quite recently by my own book. There are, at this point, several bibliographies listing dozens of books and hundreds of articles and bibliographies of these bibliographies. Today, both Kafka and Benjamin are nevertheless to a large extent known for their universally relevant reflections on modern man. Interestingly, the first interpretations for both authors were produced from a radically Jewish perspective, both by their closest and, incidentally or not, most Jewish friends, although at the end of my lecture I shouldn't be able to say this sentence anymore. For Kafka, his first interpreter was Max Brod, who read Kafka in thoroughly Jewish ways, and even in the religious sense, Jewish. The same goes for Benjamin, whose first reader, Gershom Scholem, considered Benjamin a Jewish theologian and mystic who lost his way when he turned to Marxism. Both readings were heavily disputed afterwards. Maybe the most radical polemic is Benjamin's critique of Brod's reading of Kafka. More about this soon. Today, there are largely two divergent responses in German Jewish and especially in cultural studies. Kafka and Benjamin are often considered eminently Jewish. Their environment, especially for Kafka, his demeanor, his friends, his language, supposedly, his love for the Yiddish theater, his reflections on his relationship to the Jewish community, his occasional Zionist statements. On the other hand, there are critics and thinkers who oppose this view and read, and I'm just talking about Kafka here, very differently, and what is more striking, from opposite perspectives. For Moshe Idel and others who think in a similar vein, Kafka cannot be considered quite a Jewish author because he's not rooted in Jewish learning. More specifically, Idel regards Kafka as the origin and main influence on the desolateness of German Jewish thinkers that include Benjamin and Scholem. For Idel, there is so much melancholy and desolateness that contrasts with the plenitude of Judaism, particularly Jewish mysticism, which is invoked by Benjamin and Kafka, but he believes that they deal with it in an utterly non-Jewish way. On the opposite side of the spectrum, for the philosopher Giorgio Agamben, Kafka and Benjamin are to be read as antinomian Jews who are very close to, in their thinking, to the Apostle Paul, because they they believe in suspending the law. And they are appropriated for Christianity. So the dispute about Kafka and Benjamin's Jewishness is long and ongoing. And I just gave you two opposites. And in this case, interesting because they both negate this Jewishness, both Idel and Agamben, from opposite points of view. Two examples illustrate this. Otto Pick, one of Kafka's Prague friends, reported that Kafka in 1922 talked to Scholem about his utter lack of firm Jewish ground under his feet. However, this lack of grounding, which is indeed one of the most fundamental motifs of Kafka's writing, has paradoxically itself become one of the aspects of his work characterized as eminently Jewish. Who has less ground under one's feet than the Jews? For example, you find this thinking in the French literary critic and philosopher Maurice Blanchot, but also in Judith Butler, who talks about Kafka's writing of non-arrival and her argument that Zionism is un-Jewish because Judaism is non-territorial. So there is a whole tendency to consider Kafka Jewish precisely where he carries these characteristics. Now we will talk about the problems of using Jewish as an adjective and all the stereotypes that this carries along. Most recently, one has discussed this with Kafka archive, with Max Brod's archives here in Israel, and whether they should be in the National Library or they should go to Marbach, to Germany. And Judith Butler has argued very strongly that Kafka is being the most radical writer of non-arrival his writings cannot possibly end up in Israel because Zionism considered itself as the most radical arrival, so there is an incongruity there. Meanwhile, Kafka's manuscripts that were in the Brod legacy are on the internet, and you can decide for yourself whether that means that they have now been territorialized or not. There are numerous attitudes that one can take when one discusses Benjamin's and Kafka's Jewishness. It can be biographical. So Kafka was a son of an assimilated Jewish parents, had a bar mitzvah, a Jewish environment, lived in Jewish social group. Kafka was not particularly keen on the synagogue and said the only thing that was more boring than going to the synagogue was the dance class. His bar mitzvah, which triggered intense episodes of fear and anxiety in him, consisted of a short speech, an inconsequential party, and he detested it all. But toward the end of his life, in his letter to his father, Kafka wrote famously, "I could not understand how, with the insignificant scrap of Judaism you yourself possessed, you could reproach me for not making an effort." And he does make an effort does make a reproach to his father for having delivered to him nothing but that. Kafka's attitude changed. He became enamored with the Yiddish theater. He gave a famous talk on the Yiddish language, but it was, let's say, marginal in his life. We will get to more specifics as we go along. At the end of his life, he met Dora Diamant, the daughter of a rabbinic family, and spent probably his happiest year, although he was already very sick. And together they dreamt of coming to Israel and opening a restaurant here. Kafka became more successful than Benjamin in learning Hebrew. Kafka's sisters, especially his most beloved sister, Otla, ended up killed by the Nazis in the concentration camp. One can pick and choose elements of Kafka's biography, similar of Benjamin's biography when talking about their Jewishness. Other approaches have been psychological or more philosophical. For example, Günther Anders has spoken of Kafka's negative theology when he says that for Kafka, God is dead. That God is dead is, however, for Kafka eine religiöse Tatsache, a religious fact. Now, a similar biographical story can be told about Benjamin, and I've written a long essay analyzing the passages in Benjamin's correspondence where he talks about coming to Israel, to Palestine. Benjamin procrastinated this departure until it was too late, and it is fascinating to read the passages in his letters explaining to Sholem that he's coming very soon. The latest in November, everything is ready, except that he still has some work to do in the Bibliothèque Nationale, and also his mother is sick, and then he doesn't have the money. And then he adds, yesterday I bought myself the complete volumes of Goethe in some antique. There is clearly a problem that blocked him from the inside to come, and what I analyzed in these passages is that he writes exactly like Kafka, going back and forth, and not moving an inch from the spot where he is. In Benjamin's case, this cost him his life. But I still, with all that, wouldn't say that one could locate their Jewishness in any of what I've talked about so far. The two main methodologies that are typically used to read Benjamin's and Kafka's Jewishness are either to use, especially for Kafka, in Kafka's entire fictional work, the word Jew doesn't come up, not even once. On the last page in the penal colony, there is a sentence saying, these people one cannot name. And I've only discovered this recently. And it is in another context, but the context is not so far that one could not put together here some way of not allowing himself, like a kind of prohibition to pronounce the name of God, to talk about the Jews. But it, in any case, does not exist. So one methodology is to go and pick and choose quotes from his letters, from his diaries, and they are contradictory, they are manifold, some of them are absolutely fascinating. We will see a few of them. That's one way of approaching it. Another is more allegorical. So in the case of Kafka, the castle is the Torah, the court is the final judgment, Joseph K. is the Jewish pariah. In Walter Benjamin, his very understanding of allegory as opposed to symbol is considered Jewish. There are very far-reaching ways in which one can allegorically read a Jewish dimension into the writings of these two figures. My own approach, most generally in my work, is one that originates in my priority to regard this question in terms of texts. So not the biography and not the psychology. It is just so for me, it is justified to speak of the Jewishness of an oeuvre when the context justifies it and is linked to an interpretation of a work that benefits from taking a Jewish perspective, from asking a Jewish question. Most relevantly, the one as to how our understanding of modern Judaism benefits from the work and how the view of modernity conveyed in the work is colored by these authors' Jewishness. So in the case of these two authors, certainly a great deal, but one that puts all the terms and the title into question. And I now actually come to my lecture. So, given these complexities, I will try another path, as opposed to the approaches above, namely an attempt to unravel them and eventually include one example in more detail that will encompass both Kafka and Benjamin, namely Benjamin's reading of Kafka in light of the question of their respective Jewishness. So, allow me to start with an anecdote. When I told my daughter, Tamara, about the preparation, she's a young scholar at Harvard, and I told her on the phone about the preparations for my talk and read the title to her. How Jewish were the writings and identity of Franz Kafka and Walter Benjamin? She replied, on the spot, 8.5. I thought I had misunderstood and repeated my question, and she said, well, maybe if Jewish is in quotation marks, then maybe 9. She meant 9 on 10, and if the Jewish is in quotation marks, then maybe you can give them a 9. Well, I disagreed to add the half, decided to stay with the 8.5, and used the keywords of the title, 8 of them, the half being the quotation mark, to structure my reply. So, how Jewish were the writings and identity of Franz Kafka, Walter Benjamin, and then you see the quotation marks that are the half. Okay, so let's begin. How? Is Jewishness quantifiable? The quantifiable reveals an underlying motif in the one who asked me to give this question of something like symbolic capital. If they are very Jewish, if one can reclaim them for the Jewish patrimony, well, I guess that's good for the Jews and suggests a kind of superiority of the Jewish mind that could be established, something that none of us would claim to want to ever demonstrate. Also, ironically, claims of a quantifiable identity are utterly non-Jewish, because according to Jewish law, you cannot be a little bit more or a little bit less Jewish. So the question, how Jewish, would, from this point of view, be disqualified from the start. Now, with a slight shift, it could be replaced by, how were they Jewish? A great variety of existing and possible answers, and I just give you some examples. According to their belonging to Jewishness, either to a tradition, a religion, a people, or because of their penchant for the exilic, the nomad, the cosmopolitan, or talking about the Jewish body. I haven't analyzed this so closely on their photographs, but I can imagine that Rathenau, who objected to the Jews hanging shoulders, could have made a comment, a relevant comment about their Jewish bodies. There is actually a book on their Jewish body by Sander Gilman. The Jewish body is effeminate, replaced today by the Israeli myth of masculinity and the epitome of the macho. It's not good one way or the other. The people, how were they Jewish? Because they can be associated with the people of the book, with textuality, with Talmudic thinking, with Kabbalistic parallels, because there's a certain messianic dimension of open-endedness, because of the importance of memory and the forgotten, and many more, in terms of the Bilderverbot, the prohibition on images, because of their anti-nature, so anti-pagan attitudes, there are indeed not many trees and flowers in Kafka's work. Or maybe there are, and I haven't read them, but then that's my Jewish problem. One has claimed that there is a certain monotheistic drive to the oneness. Anyone who has read Kafka and Benjamin will have a hard time to systematize their writings into one of anything. Jewish. The next word, Jewish. Don't worry. I will not ask who is a Jew, and I will leave this to the Knesset or the Rabbanut. I will instead ask what it means to apply an adjective, such as Jewish, to anything, including being. So since I'm interested in texts and writings, the question can be seen in parallel terms to, it was research I did very early on in my career, when I did feminist theory and was fascinated by the way the term écriture féminine was used. Because the word, so female, feminine writing, and what the word feminine meant there. Because it is used as an adjective, and there was a big fight between two fractions in feminism. The ones who believed that, so this was in the 80s and 90s, the Anglo-American feminists accused the French that carrying this word as an adjective would carry all the stereotypes along. And that's not completely wrong, because écriture féminine meant being irrational, being close to nature, being unconscious writing, irrational, non-systematic, and so on. So they said that this is what happens when you use this as an adjective. And it's an interesting question whether when you do this to Jewish, what kinds of stereotypes you carry along when you use it as an adjective. Because it can be used from the most rigorous of references to Jewish scriptures to the most vague of feeling Jewish, or as they call it now, Jewishly. There's a new adjective like that. No, I know what it is. It is Jewish. So, however, and one can surmise that such adjectives were problematic for both Kafka and Benjamin, but because they would go much rather for the singularity, and having Jewishness under a common denominator that would be a kind of essence would certainly be against their modernist way of thinking. And yet they both used the term quite extensively. Kafka, for example, when in his letter to the father he writes about the Jewish life, it's a quote, that he had to rest from the spare reminders of the tradition the father conveyed to him. Benjamin, in an early letter to Ludwig Strauss, describes his refusal to join the Zionists and accuses them of having failed to think the key issues in a Jewish way. And I'm quoting, "They, the Zionists, are not allowed to speak of a genuinely Jewish experience. Have they ever thought through what a Jewish school, a Jewish form of life, a Jewish politics would be?" And the sentence continues, I don't know why I omitted that. They pretend to speak Jewish and they drink German. So, now, how he himself would see these, he doesn't say. Instead adding that he would still have to figure this out. He is committed to a Kulturjudentum, but writes, "What I understand by a fertile cultural Judaism, I still have to figure out." He will never return to this question explicitly, but there are obvious traces of the Jewish tradition in his work, undeniably and mostly in relation to Messianism. Now, let's get to the next term, were. Why in the past tense? Is there a difference or is there not between what Jewish meant in their time and today? Does it matter more how Jewish they were in their time, what this term meant back then, or how looking at the Jewish dimension of their writings and identity not only informs us about their Jewishness, but possibly even shapes our imagination of the multiple ways in which Jewish can mean today? Certainly for Benjamin, dealing with works and authors of the past doesn't mean reconstructing what they actually were, wie es oder sie gewesen sind, but to gain insights into what we are today, derived from our self-observation as we project our own time into theirs. Even a quick glance at the development of Jewish interpretations of Kafka and Benjamin over the past century, a whole story and history of its own, can inform us about the complexity of the past tense of the verb form were in this title. I can't go into this, but it would be a condensed history of ideas of the past century, from Brod to Butler via Benjamin, Arendt, Derrida, Zizek, and many, many more. To the next term, writings. It's a complex word between work, in the sense of oeuvre, and writing. How Jewish were, is, are the modes of writing of Kafka and Benjamin. For some, Kafka's mode was a Mauscheln, or a modern Talmud, or a new Kabbalah. For others, it was, I'm quoting, the most crystalline German and the supreme German modernism ever written. For some, Kafka's and Benjamin's approach to literature, to history, the notion of a coherent work, to Schrift versus orality, was thoroughly Jewish. For example, one of many others, calling Kafka's writings one extensive commentary on the book of Job, of Eov, whom Kafka never mentions. For others, see Beda Aleman, associating Kafka with Jewishness, and this is in a volume called Kafka und das Judentum. And Beda Aleman, who was a famous Kafka scholar, writes in his introduction that associating Kafka with Jewishness meant a grave misunderstanding and disregard of the literariness of his work. And then the rest of the book tries to prove Beda Aleman wrong. More recently, Dan Miron rejects readings of Kafka as Zionist or Yiddishist and describes him as a kind of, quote, sentimental, ignorant, yet utterly stubborn Jew that he was. Similarly, a recent Benjamin conference that I organized in Antwerp, not so recent actually, that I organized in Antwerp, had 93 talks. It was the big Benjamin conference of the two Benjamin societies merging together. Of the 93 talks that we had on a beautiful poster with all the titles, the word Jewish was on the whole page, there once at the head of the poster saying Institute of Jewish Studies. So, and the section on religion, there were 3 talks. One talked about Benjamin's affinity with religious syncretism, the other with Gnosticism, and the third with Paulinism. The word identity. Maybe the most interesting and problematic category. Identity is a word stemming from the outside, or else is used when something is disappearing. Like the owl of Minerva that flies out at night. And when Hegel writes that philosophy in any case comes on the scene too late to give it. The word identity works like that, and I'll explain. So this is the famous quote from Hegel: when philosophy paints its gloomy picture, then a form of life has grown old. Cannot be rejuvenated, only when the dusk starts to fall does the owl of Minerva spread its wings and fly. I was once asked by a journalist about the Jews in the Jewish community in Antwerp, and particularly the Haredi Jews there. although my daughter explained that they are just Orthodox in Antwerp. Haredi, they only exist in Israel. I haven't completely figured that one out. But in any case, I was asked about their identity. And somehow it felt wrong. And it was hard to explain why, but the word didn't fit. And that is when I realized that this is a word you use when this owl has flown away. And it's just a sense. I haven't fully developed the argument, but I would be curious to hear what you think about this. Okay. So, wait. Let me still give you one reflection about the issue of identity. Both Benjamin and Kafka's Jewish identity is such a case. They lived their Jewishness in a time when the very notion of identity designated a crisis, as in the title of Jacques Loridair's book, The Modernist Crisis of Identity, which is made up of two big crises of identity that he sees as fundamental to modernity. It's Viennese modernity he's talking about, and the one are the homosexuals and the other the Jews. So gender identity and Jewish identity. Now, why this is more true for Jews? Possibly the rise of strong nationalist feelings in the mid-19th century created certain intense notions of identity connected with locality. This didn't quite work for the Jews, and I'm talking about the first half of the 20th century, unless they became Zionists, and even then. So to them, identity had to be religious, cultural, the people of the book, and so on. There was something there that lent the crisis of modern man and his identity could be associated easily with the amalgam of a Jewish identity as such. Now, the next words, Franz Kafka. I will just give you a quote, one from Kafka and one from Benjamin. What do I have in common with Jews? I have barely anything in common with myself and should put myself quietly in a corner, content that I can breathe. So, in this quote, even the possibility of being a unity as an individual in himself, he associates this with the very question of a collective identity, and it is equally questionable. Kafka doesn't give an answer, and the rest is literature, because what does it mean exactly to put himself in a corner? Is this a self-punishment, like children who are being put in a corner? Or is it maybe the furthest point in a room from the center? Walter Benjamin. It's also from an early letter to Ludwig Strauss. And then I'm going to bring the two together. As far as ideas and people are concerned, I have for myself discovered the highest, das Höchste, as Jewish. And what I've understood, I can sum up in one formula: when I live as a conscious human being, then I live as a conscious Jew. Now, the sentence sounds very different if you read it in German, because then you get Mensch, you get the word Mensch, and when you have it with its Yiddish inflection, it sounds definitely different. But what I find interesting in the juxtaposition of these two, so in both cases, very differently, they question the very notion of identity in the sense of an ethnic, cultural, religious particularity in two opposite directions. Kafka dissolves even his own individual identity, and Benjamin extends it to the whole of humanity. In both cases, the question of their Jewishness elides any defined contour, but occurs via a detour of a general condition, the condition of being étranger à soi-même, of being a stranger to oneself, and that whole modernist issue of je et un autre, that, you know, that the Enlightenment subject is no longer a whole and an entity, or to expand it to the universal. The word and I have to go a bit quicker here, because what I would have liked to do with the and, but I'll just sum it up briefly and we'll come to the end. The word and relates Kafka and Benjamin by way of Benjamin's reading of Kafka. And it is a fascinating story in itself when one looks at how Benjamin reads Kafka Jewishly. It is particularly interesting when one makes a comparison between Sholem and Benjamin and their ways of reading Kafka. So, for Sholem, he regards the, quote, possibility of divine judgment as the sole concern of Kafka's writings. In his discussion about Kafka with Benjamin, he develops a kind of negative theology of an absent God, and calls Kafka's writing the epitome of the nothingness of revelation. So this is Gershom Scholem at its negative theological extreme. While Scholem thinks in theological categories of Kafka's references to the law, Benjamin is less interested in Gott and more concerned with the ways the Talmudic tradition, more particularly the interaction between Halacha and Agadah, provide insights. He calls Kafka an Agadah to the Halacha, and defines the way in which Kafka's stories work as subversive of the law. But in introducing the notion of Halacha and Agadah, it is interesting to look at how the relationship between Halacha and Agadah work in the Talmud. And I'm referring here very quickly to the work on this by Moshe Halbertal. He says there are three kinds of ways in which the Agadah, the Agadic dimension of the Talmud can relate to the halachic one. And he says one is simply illustrative, so it illustrates and confirms. The second is that it broadens the application, so you can apply it to another context. And the third is subversive. The third, and he says, well, it's not, and there's a crucial difference, it's not transgressive, it's subversive. In that it puts a certain stop by bringing in, through the narrative, by bringing in the human dimension. It puts a certain limit to the halachic that says the halacha can work in human matters only till here. And Moshe Halbertal gave this beautiful example of the Agadah of the butcher and the rabbi who, about the halacha of having to make oneself available before Yom Kippur to the one who has wronged you. And the rabbi waits and the butcher doesn't come, so the rabbi decides to go to the butcher. And the student of the rabbi says, look, my rabbi is about to go and kill somebody. And the rabbi goes and gets to the butcher, and the butcher somehow is so shocked when he sees the rabbi in his butcher shop that he does something wrong with the axe and the bone gets into his throat and he dies. And that's the story. So how come that kind of an Agadah is linked to the halacha of having to make yourself available? And the explanation is that this kind of that what is introduced here is a human factor of having been cornered. The butcher was cornered by the rabbi. So there is a certain way in which the Agadah here puts a halt to the halacha. And I'm making this gesture because Benjamin writes here, Kafka's writings do not modestly lie at the feet of the doctrine as the, in German, Haggadah, lies at the feet of the Halakha. Though apparently reduced to submission, they unexpectedly raise a mighty paw against it. So that mighty paw can be read, a paw, why a paw? Because there's something creaturely. It is that in the human that is, let's say, the affect of the moment when the butcher saw the rabbi come in. But it is also a paw because it does this gesture. It raises a paw. But that certainly does not mean that it crushes it. And so the reading, unlike Sholem, who has a certain antinomian, you know, Sholem has this approach to, as in redemption through sin, of transgression as a mode. And in relation to Kafka, he writes that the law, Kafka shows how the law is something unvollziehbar and therefore ought to be transgressed. And this is really, this comes very close to a Paulinian thinking, because that's what the Apostle Paul says, that the law should be abrogated because it turns us into sinners, because it's not, it's not within the human capacity to fulfill it. Now, the whole issue of fulfilling the law is, Christ fulfilled the law once and for all. And I think Benjamin comes very close to an understanding of the law as not being something that ought to be fulfilled, but that is something that ought to be, so this is in his reading of Before the Law, that it is something that is negotiated with, that is, and it's not about entering the law. And so the reason why this is my end between Benjamin and Sholem is because it is interesting to see how one always has accused Sholem of Judaizing Benjamin. He is the one who knows, and Benjamin is the Amaretz. And it is interesting to see that one can read the end between Benjamin and Kafka in a way that makes Benjamin, in some perspectives, more Jewish than Sholem. So I'm coming to the end. What is my end? I haven't done all my words yet. I haven't done the quotation mark. And the quotation mark is a big story. It's my final, almost final item in the title. What seems rather innocuous here is, I will show as briefly as possible, a big story. The usage of quotation marks generally indicates either a quote or a not quite literal sense of a word. I imagine that it was introduced in the title, because that's how I got the title in writing. It was suggested to me to say something like so-called Jewish, in the context of the question, a necessity if one wants to avoid regarding Jewishness as an essence. So an intellectual today would, Gott behüte, not want to use the Jewish as an essence. But very briefly, the quotation marks have their own story. In Jean-François Lyotard's book, Heidegger et les Juifs, he speaks of Jews in quotation marks and no capital letter, and on the very end, which he distinguishes from Jews without quotation marks and with a capital letter. The Jews without capital letter and small, yes, here, it's my last quote here. This is what he writes on the first page. Jews are a non-people of exiled survivors of trauma, dictatorialized, non-essential, non-identitarian, marginalized, and they can be anyone who understands himself or lives and acts in this way. Now for Lyotard, Jews, these non-people who can be anyone, are the good version of the bad Jews with a quotation with a capital letter and without quotation marks, who claim an identity and who claim, again, Gott behüte territory. So you see that here this notion of the Jewish reaches its extreme clash between being anyone and being something essential and identitarian. Now, to end, it may be worth going back to 8.5 and take it as more than a pun, indicating the serious possibility of the arbitrariness and diversity of possible answers to the question. 8.5 is obviously a reference to Fellini's movie from 1963, 8.5. What is Fellini's 8.5 about? It is Fellini's 9th film. And what is 9 is Yelda, the birth, the 9 months of birth. Now, 8.5 is his 9th film, but it is a film about making a film. Namely, it is the film about making this very film. So I therefore conclude that the reply to the question how Jewish were the writings and identity of Kafka and Benjamin lies less in any determinable significance, the motivation, historical, geographical, cultural, religious context, than in an understanding of what we are asking, and that we can derive from each word in the title an awareness that the stakes are in the question we ask. Maybe my daughter was right, after all, right about the 9 rather than the 8.5, but for other reasons. I indeed forgot to count another half of the sign in my title, the question mark at the end. And if the reply is that Kafka's and Benjamin's Jewishness is something like Fellini's movie that is in the making, we here have, in the way we ask the question, maybe somewhat participated in this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Liska, for those reflections on the title. I think it also gives us an opportunity to reflect on our own title, especially changing it to the Department of Jewish Philosophy. And we can ask also, I think, a number of questions, like how Jewish is philosophy? How is philosophy Jewish? Was philosophy ever Jewish? And when you put the quotation marks, you know, philosophy or Jewish, this changes everything. And the question mark is also that, and maybe this is also doing Jewish philosophy. So thank you very, very much, and I wish everybody a great sort of end of the semester, and with this we'll conclude our conference, הכנס הראשון לדוקטורנטים על שם ציפי Kaufman.
Thank you. Wow.